I stood in my office, staring out over the Lexington skyline, the lights of the city shimmering in the cold December night. From the 17th floor, I could see most of downtown, bright, busy, alive even at this hour. This view had always been a source of pride for me. It was a reminder of how far I'd come. A kid from a modest neighborhood who worked his way through law school at the University of Kentucky, now managing partner at McCall and Holt LLP. 45 years old, with a reputation as one of the most reliable real estate attorneys in the state. I handled the big deals, the ones that shaped this city. My success had given my family a life I never had growing up. Kelly, my wife of 15 years, and our two kids, Emily and Jack, lived comfortably in Ashford Heights, a neighborhood reserved for the kind of people I once thought were untouchable. A sprawling colonial home, perfect in every detail, just the way Kelly liked it. The grandfather clock in the corner of my office chimed 10. Another late night. I packed up the rest of the files on my desk, sliding them into my briefcase, knowing the house would be quiet by the time I got home. Emily and Jack would be asleep. Kelly might still be up, curled under a blanket in the living room, or more likely in bed reading one of her novels. As I pulled into our driveway, the house lights were still on. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of Kelly. She was standing at the counter, her phone pressed to her ear, laughing softly. It wasn't the usual carefree laugh I knew so well. It was that particular laugh, the one she used when she wanted to impress someone. By the time I stepped through the front door, she had ended the call. "Late night?" she asked, greeting me with a kiss on the cheek. She wore a sleek black dress that I hadn't seen before, something stylish and expensive. Her hair was perfect, makeup still fresh despite the late hour. "Had to wrap up some things at the office," I replied, setting my briefcase down by the stairs. "Who were you talking to?" "Oh, just Rebecca from the hospital board," she said quickly, moving around the kitchen, reorganizing things that didn't need to be rearranged. Rebecca had been at our house just last week for dinner. She'd been too busy to even return messages, let alone chat on the phone this late. I didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, I poured myself a drink and watched her quietly. The following week, Kelly was out more often, late-night charity meetings at Grace Hill Community Church, planning events for the Children's Hospital benefit. She was always busy. I tried to let it go. But doubt is a funny thing. Once it creeps in, it doesn't leave. One evening, I found myself in the study, looking for a book to unwind with. Kelly was out again, supposedly at a board meeting. The bookshelf in the corner hadn't been touched in months, so I figured I'd grab one of the old hardcovers collecting dust. As I pulled out a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, something slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. It was an envelope. I knelt to pick it up, flipping it over in my hands. There was no writing on it, just a plain, unmarked envelope, thicker than it should have been. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. Cash. Stacks of $100 bills. I pulled the book fully off the shelf and looked closer. There were more envelopes, 4 of them, hidden behind the row of books, carefully tucked away where no one would think to look. I sat down at the desk, spreading them out in front of me, counting silently. Over $12,000 in cash. I stared at the money, trying to piece together an explanation that made sense. We weren't the kind of couple who kept large sums of cash hidden away. Kelly handled the household expenses, sure, but this wasn't for groceries or last-minute emergencies. This felt deliberate, secretive. When Kelly came home that night, I didn't mention it. I left the envelopes where I found them, but I started paying closer attention. Over the next few days, I checked the bookshelf when Kelly wasn't home. Each time, the cash was still there, untouched but carefully hidden. On Friday evening, Kelly left for another late meeting. Once I was sure she was gone, I opened the envelopes again. This time, I found something else tucked inside one of them, a receipt for a hotel stay. A boutique hotel on the edge of town. A 2-night stay, paid in cash, under a name I didn't recognize. I sat at the desk, gripping the receipt so tightly it crumpled in my hand. When Kelly returned that night, I was sitting in the living room, drink in hand, waiting. She walked in casually, brushing snow off her coat. "Hey, you're still up," she said lightly. I watched her carefully. "How was the meeting?" "Productive," she replied. "We finalized plans for the fundraiser." I took a slow sip of scotch, letting the silence linger. "Which hotel did you guys meet at?" I asked, my voice calm but deliberate. Kelly's hand froze on the buttons of her coat. "Hotel?" I set the glass down carefully. "You heard me." Her eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw something unfamiliar in them: panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said too quickly. I nodded slowly. "I found the envelopes." For a brief second, she didn't move. Then, she stepped forward, her expression softening. "Jonathan, it's not what you think. Isn't it?" I kept my tone steady, even as the rage twisted inside me. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, standing up. "Not tonight." I left her standing there in the kitchen, coat still on, as I made my way upstairs. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. For the first time in 15 years, I slept in the guest room. Desperate measures. The call came at 6:15 a.m., jolting me from a restless sleep in my home office. Jack's voice cracked on the other end, thick with something I hadn't heard from him in years: fear. "Dad, can you come home right now? I found something." I rubbed my eyes, sitting up straighter. "What is it, Jack? Where's your mom?" "She left early. Said she had a meeting at the church. But I found this in one of her books when I was looking for my homework." I glanced at the clock. I hadn't been in our bedroom since the night I found the cash in the study. I slept downstairs now. Kelly hadn't pressed me about it, but the weight of what I'd discovered loomed between us in the unspoken quiet of the house. "I'll be there in 20, I told him. "Don't say anything to your sister. Just wait for me outside." By the time I pulled into the driveway, Jack was sitting under the oak tree near the garden, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He was pale, chewing nervously at his lip the way he did when he was younger and scared. I parked and walked over, crouching beside him. "What did you find?" Wordlessly, he pulled a small envelope from his pocket. It was crinkled at the edges like it had been handled too much. I took it from him and carefully peeled it open. Inside was a receipt. A deposit slip from a local bank. $9,500 cash deposit. The date on the slip stopped me cold. It was 2 weeks ago, the same day Kelly told me she was helping organize the church's charity auction. "I found it in one of Mom's cookbooks," Jack said quietly. "It just fell out when I grabbed the book off the shelf. I don't know why she'd put it there, but, Dad, why does she have this much cash?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the envelope pressing into my palm. "That's what I'm going to find out," I said. "Thank you for showing me this, Jack. Does Emily know anything?" He shook his head. "She doesn't really notice stuff like this, but I have. Mom's been weird. She disappears a lot. And there's been someone stopping by the house when you're not here." My jaw tightened. "Who?" "I think it's Pastor Mark." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I saw him once through the window when he thought I was at soccer practice. They were talking in the living room." My grip on the deposit slip tightened until the edges curled between my fingers. "Listen to me, Jack," I said, lowering my voice. "I need you to pretend you don't know about this. Go to school. Act like everything's normal. Can you do that?" He hesitated for a moment, but nodded. "Good," I said, squeezing his shoulder. "I'll take care of this. You did the right thing by coming to me." As Jack walked back into the house to grab his things for school, I sat on the garden bench, the receipt still in my hand. The edges blurred as I stared at it, the reality of what was happening sinking in. By mid-morning, I was back in my office downtown, pacing the length of the room. The envelope sat on my desk, alongside the first stack of cash I'd found in the bookshelf. The 2 deposits totaled over 20 grand. I'd known Kelly had been distant for months, but this was something else entirely. I called David Holt, my business partner and closest friend for over 20 years. He answered on the second ring. "John, you're calling early. What's up?" "I need you to help me look into someone," I said, staring at the bank slip. "Off the record." There was a pause on the line. "Who are we talking about?" "Mark Callahan." David sighed heavily. "The pastor? I thought you and Kelly were close to him." "Not as close as she is, apparently." My voice was sharper than I intended. David didn't ask questions. He never did. "I'll pull some contacts. See if anything unusual pops up. Anything specific I should be looking for?" bank records, assets. If he's moving large amounts of cash under the table, I want to know about it. You think he's involved in something illegal? I thought about Jack's face that morning, about the cash hidden in books and the late-night meetings Kelly never seemed to have a clear answer for. I don't know what to think, I admitted, but something isn't right. David promised to call back once he had something. By late afternoon, I was no closer to answers. Kelly hadn't responded to the few casual texts I'd sent during the day. Normally, that wouldn't bother me, but today it felt deliberate. Around 5, David called back. John, you're not going to like this. I sat forward at my desk, phone pressed tightly to my ear. What did you find? Mark Callahan has been renting a private cabin outside town. Paid in cash, under a different name. My heart pounded. It gets worse, David continued. The name on the reservation? Kelly McCall. I said nothing. I couldn't. I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't look good, David added. Want me to keep digging? No, I said quietly. I'll handle it from here. I ended the call and sat there, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The room felt too quiet. The hum of the city outside barely registered as I tried to process what I just learned. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the late nights. It was all of it. And now I had proof. By the time I got home, Kelly was already there, standing in the kitchen. She smiled when she saw me, like nothing had changed. How was work? She asked, casually sipping a glass of wine. I set my briefcase down by the door and leaned against the counter, watching her closely. It was fine, I said. David called. He found something interesting. Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Oh, she said, forcing a light laugh. What was it this time? I pulled the deposit slip from my pocket and placed it on the counter between us. Her expression shifted, and I saw it. The panic, the flicker of realization that the game was up. Kelly, I said quietly, where's the rest of the money? She opened her mouth to respond but said nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. And for the first time in 15 years, I saw my wife for who she really was. At precisely noon, David Holt entered my office, his expression hard as stone. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just dropped a thick folder onto my desk, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. You're not going to like this, John, he said. I glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it immediately. That seems to be a trend lately. David didn't sit. He crossed his arms, standing like a man delivering bad news he wished he didn't have. I pulled what you asked for on Mark Callahan, he said. I know you were suspicious, but this is worse than I expected. I finally opened the folder. The first page was a background check, one I'd expected to show nothing more than a clean record and a few previous jobs. Instead, it read like something out of a crime novel. Callahan Group Incorporated, I muttered aloud, scanning the paper. What is this? His company from 8 years ago. Real estate investment, on paper anyway, David replied. It folded after the feds started sniffing around for embezzlement. There wasn't enough to charge him, but several investors lost everything. The case went cold. I flipped the page and saw another company, Blue Ridge Development. The name tugged at something in the back of my mind. He was linked to offshore accounts in the Caymans through Blue Ridge, David continued. And that's not the half of it. His name came up during a DEA investigation 2 years ago. The feds suspected that one of his development sites was being used to move product. I frowned, narrowing my eyes at the document. Product? Are you telling me Mark Callahan was running drugs? David nodded grimly. Not directly, but the development was suspected of being a laundering front for a trafficking ring operating out of eastern Kentucky. Again, nothing ever stuck to him. The charges never went anywhere. He must have greased the right palms. I tossed the folder on the desk, leaning back in my chair. So, the man my wife spends half her time with, the same man leading Grace Hill Community Church, was skimming off real estate deals and laundering money for a drug operation? David's lips tightened. It gets worse. Of course it did. David pulled a flash drive from his pocket, handing it over. I had one of my tech guys check financial records for Grace Hill. Callahan's been bleeding money from the church. Over 70 grand unaccounted for in the last 18 months. I turned the flash drive over in my fingers, weighing it as if it physically carried the weight of the betrayal. Embezzlement, I muttered. David nodded. And I found another account, private, under his mother's name. The deposits match almost to the dollar what's missing from Grace Hill. My jaw tightened. I thought about the families who trusted him, the single mothers dropping tithes into that collection plate, the elderly churchgoers donating to causes they believed in, and all the while, Callahan had been robbing them blind. What about Kelly? I finally asked, my voice lower. David sighed. John, I think she's been covering for him. I stared at him for a long moment, feeling the words settle into my chest like a heavy stone. She's been pulling cash out in small amounts, David continued. The deposits into Callahan's personal accounts line up with those withdrawals. I'm not saying she knows everything, but she's involved, whether she realizes how deep it goes or not. I ran a hand over my face, exhaling slowly. I could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. What's his endgame? I asked, meeting David's gaze. I'm not sure yet, but whatever it is, he's been laying the groundwork for a while. And Kelly's right in the middle of it. That evening, I sat in the living room with the folder still open on the coffee table. I hadn't touched dinner. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. The kids were at a friend's house, and Kelly was supposed to be at a church meeting. I swirled the scotch in my glass, watching the amber liquid dance along the edges. My mind kept circling the same question. How long had this been happening? Around 8 p.m., the front door opened. Kelly walked in, carrying a bag of groceries, her expression softening when she saw me. Hey, she said with a warm smile. You're home early. I set the glass down, watching her carefully as she slipped off her coat and set the bag down on the counter. I figured I'd take the night off, I replied casually. Thought I'd catch up on a few things here. She turned to face me, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You've been working too hard. You need more nights off. I smiled faintly, but it didn't reach my eyes. I wanted to ask you something, I said, tilting my head slightly. Kelly froze for just a second, but she recovered quickly. Sure. What's up? I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. Where's the money, Kelly? Her face paled instantly. What do you mean? I gestured to the folder on the table. The deposits. The withdrawals. The $45,000 you've been hiding. David found it. I know about all of it. Kelly's eyes flickered to the folder, and I watched her carefully, waiting for her to deny it. Instead, she took a step back. Jonathan, it's not what you think. Isn't it? I stood, closing the distance between us. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I was trying to help. Help who? I demanded. Mark, she whispered, barely meeting my gaze. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. He told me the church was in trouble, she added quickly. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know about the rest. I swear. Kelly, I said, lowering my voice, Mark isn't just in trouble. He's a criminal. He's stealing from the church, laundering money, and God knows what else. And now you're part of it. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't move to comfort her. I didn't know, she said again, voice cracking. I shook my head, stepping away. I wish I could believe that. I grabbed my coat, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them from her. David Holt sat across from me in my office at dawn, his laptop open on the table, casting a cold blue glow over the room. His expression was grim as he scrolled through files, tapping occasionally on the keyboard. You're going to want to see this, he said, turning the screen toward me. I leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the spreadsheets and email chains displayed across the monitor. This is Callahan's, David said. I pulled what I could from public records and ran a few deeper checks through some contacts at the state police. What we've got here isn't just embezzlement, John. It's much bigger than that. I studied the numbers, the bank records, and offshore accounts neatly organized in front of me. Money moved in and out of Grace Hill Community Church with no clear paper trail, 70, 80, sometimes $90,000 at a time. He's been laundering drug money through the church, David continued, his voice flat. The deposits tie back to known fronts operating out of Louisville and eastern Kentucky. I found connections to 3 minor trafficking rings. Callahan's been skimming, taking his cut while keeping the church as a clean front. But it gets worse. I looked up, already feeling the anger begin to simmer. David's face hardened. He's involving kids, John. Teenagers from the youth group. He's using them as runners. My heart stopped for a moment. Say that again, I said, voice cold and steady. Grace Hill's outreach programs. Callahan's been recruiting some of the more vulnerable kids. He grooms them, makes them feel important. They think they're part of the church's street ministry, but he's sending them out with shipments. Most of them don't even realize what they're carrying. I clenched my fists beneath the table. How many? I asked. 7, David replied quietly. That we know of. I stood, pacing to the window, staring out over the Lexington skyline. The anger boiled beneath my skin, but I forced myself to stay calm. Does Kelly know? I asked after a long silence. David hesitated. There's no direct evidence, but John, she's been involved in the church's youth programs. If Callahan's been running this right under her nose, it's hard to believe she hasn't noticed something. Whether she's turning a blind eye or actively helping him, I don't know. I ran a hand over my face, exhaling slowly. She's been pulling cash from our accounts, I muttered. Hiding it in that separate account. David nodded. Callahan's got her wrapped around his finger. She's either complicit or too deep to pull herself out. I turned back to him. I want everything you can dig up on Callahan. Everything. I don't care how far back it goes. If there's a skeleton, I want to know where it's buried. David nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard. You know what this means, John, he said without looking up. If you expose him, you're dragging Kelly down with him. I know, I replied, my voice hard. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched dinner Kelly had left out for me. She had gone to another late church meeting, leaving the house quiet. Jack was upstairs playing video games, and Emily was at a friend's house for the night. I pulled the folder David had given me closer, flipping through the pages. Pictures of the kids Callahan had recruited. Innocent faces, some I even recognized from church gatherings. One name stood out, Mason Fuller. A quiet 15-year-old who often volunteered alongside Kelly at the food drives. I remembered seeing him last week, standing by Callahan's side as they unloaded boxes from the back of a van. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. By midnight, Kelly still wasn't home. I stayed up, pacing the living room. When the front door finally opened, I was waiting. She froze when she saw me. You're up late, she said carefully, hanging her coat by the door. I didn't respond right away. I watched her, studying every nervous flicker in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. How was the meeting? I asked finally. She gave a small smile. Productive. We're planning next month's outreach. I leaned back against the counter, folding my arms. Kelly, I said quietly, what do you know about Mason Fuller? Her smile faltered. He's part of the youth group, she replied, her tone too casual. Why? He's running drugs for Mark Callahan, I said bluntly. She blinked, her hand hovering over the counter. For a moment, I thought she might deny it. Instead, she dropped her gaze. I didn't know for sure, she whispered. I thought something felt wrong, but Mark said it was just community work. He's been helping them get jobs, keeping them off the streets. He's been using them. I cut her off sharply. Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't soften. You've been pulling cash out of our accounts, Kelly, I said. How much of it went to him? She swallowed hard. I thought I was helping. He said the church was struggling, that the programs needed funding. I didn't think. You didn't think he was laundering drug money through our church? I stepped forward, lowering my voice. You didn't think to tell me? Her tears spilled over, but I shook my head. You let him use kids, I said, my voice like ice. And you let him use our family's money to cover it up. I didn't know, she pleaded. I swear I didn't know how deep it went. I stared at her, feeling the weight of years of trust and love crumbling in real time. I can fix this, I said, turning away from her. But it's going to get ugly. Kelly reached for my arm, but I pulled away. I have to stop him, I said, before he ruins more lives. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. This wasn't just about Kelly anymore. It was about every kid Callahan had exploited, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I waited 3 days, just long enough for Kelly to think the worst had passed, long enough for her to believe that whatever I had discovered, I was still struggling to process it. I wasn't. On a quiet Thursday morning, I drove downtown and filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. It wasn't a rash decision. The timing wasn't random. Kelly had just wrapped up one of her charity luncheons with the Grace Hill ladies, the same circle she used to quietly spread her carefully constructed narrative, the devoted wife with the overworked husband. I knew exactly how this would look to them, and that was the point. The papers weren't served at home. No, I wanted her to feel it. I had them delivered by the county sheriff directly to the church, just after morning prayer. I made sure Mark Callahan was there when it happened. By the time I returned to my office, my phone was already ringing. Jonathan, what the hell is this? Kelly's voice cracked with barely concealed panic. You got the papers, then? I asked, leaning back in my chair, keeping my tone even. You had me served at church, she hissed. In front of everyone. Mark was standing right next to me when it happened. Do you know how humiliating that was? Yes, I replied. That was the idea. Come by the house tonight. We need to talk. I'm not coming anywhere until you explain this. I'll call Mark. No, you won't. My voice dropped. If you involve him, the next papers will include the evidence. Photographs, financial records, and explicit details of what's been happening between the two of you. The line went silent. I'll be there at 7, she finally said, her voice shaking. Good. I ended the call, staring at the folder on my desk. The noose was tightening, and she knew it. At exactly 7 p.m., Kelly walked through the front door, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She had dressed carefully, soft blue blouse, simple skirt, a silver cross hanging just below her collarbone. Her makeup was flawless. She was trying to control the narrative before it began. I let her sit for a moment on the edge of the couch before I joined her in the living room. I didn't speak. Instead, I dropped the folder onto the table between us and slowly opened it. I want to make sure you understand exactly why I filed for divorce, I said. Kelly's eyes flickered nervously to the contents. I saw the color drain from her face the second she recognized the first photograph. It was her, in that same blue blouse, tangled with Mark Callahan in the back seat of his car behind the church parking lot. I took my time laying out the rest. Images of hotel check-ins, receipts for weekend stays under fake names, a parking garage surveillance shot of the two of them kissing before one of his late-night prayer meetings. Jonathan, I interrupted, cold and steady. We're past the point of explanations. Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't flinch. How long? I asked quietly, leaning back in my chair. She wiped at her cheek, struggling to hold herself together. It wasn't. I didn't mean for it to happen. That's not what I asked. Her lips trembled. About 6 months. I nodded, exhaling slowly. I already knew the answer, but hearing her say it out loud settled something inside me. I assume the money you've been pulling out of our accounts went to him as well? I asked, flipping to the bank records. She didn't deny it. He said the church needed help, she whispered. He told me it was for the outreach programs. For the kids. I stared at her, my face unreadable. Mark Callahan's been laundering drug money through the church. Did he tell you that part? Her eyes shot up in shock. What? I slid another document toward her. That's from David Holt. He pulled the financials. Mark's been bleeding the church dry, skimming from donations, using teenagers from the youth group to move shipments across the county. And now, thanks to you, our money is tied to it. Kelly's hand flew to her mouth. I didn't know. Yes, you did. I cut her off sharply. You just chose to look the other way. Tears spilled over, but I didn't soften. You had sex with him in our church, Kelly, I said, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the room. You stole from me to cover for him, and you let him use our money to bankroll whatever criminal enterprise he's running. Her body shook with sobs, but I sat still, watching her unravel. I was lonely, she choked out, the same tired excuse I'd heard a dozen times before. I stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. You destroyed our family, I said quietly. You lied to me. To Emily and Jack. Kelly looked up, desperate now. Jonathan, please, don't do this. We can fix it. Mark doesn't have to be part of this anymore. I'll end it. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. It's already ended. You just don't realize it yet. I stood, closing the folder and tucking it under my arm. You'll stay with your sister tonight, I said, not bothering to look at her. Pack a bag. Jonathan. I said pack a bag. She hesitated, then finally rose, disappearing upstairs. I waited, staring into the fireplace, listening to the faint sound of her footsteps creaking overhead. When she left, I called David. She's talking, I said simply. Good, David replied. The DA will need more to tie Callahan to the trafficking, but this is a start. I'll get what we need, I replied coldly. Mark Callahan thought he could steal from me, sleep with my wife, use kids from the church like pawns. By the time I was done, he'd wish he never set foot in Grace Hill. By morning, the fallout had begun. News of Mark Callahan's arrest spread quickly across Lexington. His face was plastered on every local channel, his mugshot sitting neatly beneath headlines of fraud, trafficking, and child endangerment. By noon, national outlets had picked up the story, peeling back layers of deception that stretched far beyond the walls of Grace Hill Community Church. I sat at my office desk, the soft hum of the news broadcast above me, filling the otherwise quiet room. Footage from the gala played on repeat. The moment Callahan was escorted out in cuffs, the stunned faces of donors and congregation members frozen behind him. Kelly trailed behind in the footage, head down, shoulders slumped. I took a slow sip of coffee as the phone buzzed beside me. I didn't bother to check who it was. Kelly, I answered, leaning back in my chair. Jonathan, she breathed, barely above a whisper. You have to stop this. It's gone far enough. I let the silence linger, hearing the strain in her voice. You think this is about me? I finally replied. You still don't get it. I didn't know how deep it went, she choked out. I swear. I thought Mark was trying to help the church. You didn't know, I repeated quietly, the words heavy. I stared at the TV screen as Callahan's mugshot faded into an image of Grace Hill's youth program, smiling children at a summer retreat. You didn't know he was laundering money. You didn't know he was running drugs through the church. And you didn't know he was using the kids to do it. I didn't, she insisted, voice trembling. I set the mug down, running a hand over my face. But you knew about the affair. Her breath caught. I waited for her to respond, but she didn't. You're not seeing the kids until I say so, I added, cutting through the tension. Jonathan. Not yet. The office door creaked open, and Jack stepped inside, holding his tablet. I gestured for him to wait as I ended the call without another word. Jack slid into the chair across from me, fidgeting with the corner of his screen. His eyes flickered between me and the muted news broadcast overhead. Dad, he asked, his voice small. I turned to him, softening my expression. What's up, bud? Is Pastor Mark going to jail forever? Jack's gaze didn't lift from his lap. I watched him closely, trying to read between the lines. He's going to be gone for a long time, I said carefully. You don't have to worry about him anymore. Jack nodded, but didn't look relieved. Is Mom in trouble too? The question hit harder than I expected. She made some bad choices, I admitted, leaning forward, but I'm going to make sure everything's okay. That's my job. Jack's eyes finally met mine. I don't want things to be weird. I forced a smile, reaching across the desk to ruffle his hair. We'll figure it out together. That seemed to satisfy him for now. Jack slid out of the chair and padded back down the hall, tablet tucked under his arm. As soon as the door closed, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was David. John, he said as I answered, you need to see this. What is it? I pulled the rest of Callahan's encrypted files. He was more paranoid than we thought. I straightened in my chair. Go on. I found emails, David continued. Callahan was planning to leave the country. Alone. I frowned. Without Kelly? Yeah. He had personal accounts offshore under different aliases. There were also large transfers made in the last 6 months, too large to just disappear quietly. He knew the walls were closing in. I paced to the window, the weight of it settling over me. He was ready to cut and run? Exactly. But here's the kicker, David added, lowering his voice. One of the emails mentioned someone else. He was trying to pin the drug trafficking and embezzlement on Kelly if things fell apart. The coffee mug in my hand felt heavier suddenly. I exhaled slowly. Of course he was. He was setting her up, John. She might have been blind to it, but Callahan had no intention of protecting her. He planned to make her the scapegoat. I stayed silent for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Send me everything you found, I said finally. Already did. I'm also forwarding it to the DA. Thanks, David. Keep me posted. Later that evening, I found Emily in the backyard, sitting quietly beneath the oak tree. The sky was painted with soft oranges and purples, and the late summer breeze whispered through the leaves. I sat down beside her, resting my arms on my knees. She didn't look at me right away, her eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. I saw the news, she said softly. I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. You're mad, she added, her voice barely audible. I shook my head. No, Em, I'm not mad. She finally turned to face me, uncertainty clouding her expression. I didn't know everything, but I knew Mom was hiding things. I know, I said. This wasn't your fault. Her gaze dropped to her lap. It's hard to know who to trust. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You can always trust me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I just want things to be normal again, she whispered. We'll get there, I assured her. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. We sat together beneath the fading light until Jack came running through the yard, his laughter cutting through the tension like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emily wiped her eyes and smiled faintly as Jack collapsed into the grass beside us. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. Callahan was gone. The pieces of our family were fractured, but they weren't beyond repair. And no matter how long it took, I was going to put them back together. The day of Mark Callahan's sentencing came faster than I expected. I sat in the front row of the Lexington courthouse, hands folded in my lap, eyes fixed on the man who had nearly dismantled my life. Callahan sat at the defense table, dressed in a cheap gray suit that did nothing to hide the wear of the past few months. He looked thinner, more drawn, as if the weight of his sins had finally started to settle on him. Good. Kelly wasn't there. I made sure of that. She had fled to her sister's house in Cincinnati after Callahan's arrest, the shame of her involvement too heavy for her to carry in public. Emily and Jack were at school. I didn't want them anywhere near this. This was for me. The courtroom filled quickly. Members of the church, reporters, and the families who had unknowingly supported Callahan's operations sat scattered throughout the gallery. Murmurs filled the space, hushed conversations buzzing beneath the surface like static. I felt David slide into the seat beside me. You ready for this? He asked quietly, flipping through a folder of documents Callahan's lawyers had tried to bury during the investigation. I've been ready, I replied, not taking my eyes off Callahan. Judge Adrian Reynolds entered moments later, his stern gaze sweeping over the room before settling at the bench. The room silenced instantly. All rise, the bailiff instructed. We stood, and I could feel Callahan's eyes briefly flicker in my direction before snapping back to the judge. As we sat, Adrian wasted no time. We're here today for sentencing in the case of the Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Mark Callahan. The defendant has been found guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to distribute illegal substances. The court has reviewed the evidence presented during the trial and the testimony of those impacted by Mr. Callahan's actions. His gaze hardened. Mr. Callahan, do you have anything to say before sentencing? Callahan slowly rose to his feet. He scanned the room carefully, pausing only briefly when his eyes landed on me. I made mistakes, he began, his voice softer than I remembered. I admit that. I let pride and ambition take me down the wrong path, and I deeply regret the pain I've caused. I clenched my jaw, biting back the urge to stand and call him out for the liar he was. I asked the court for leniency, Callahan continued, turning his attention to Adrian. I believe I can still make amends and contribute positively to the community I've let down. The judge listened in silence, expression unreadable as Callahan returned to his seat. Adrian leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the bench. Mr. Callahan, you were entrusted with the spiritual and emotional well-being of your community. Instead, you exploited that trust for personal gain, involving innocent minors and vulnerable families in criminal activity. Your actions have left lasting scars on this community and on those closest to you. Callahan's face tightened, but he said nothing. Given the severity of these crimes, Adrian continued, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. I exhaled slowly, the knot in my chest loosening just a little. Callahan's shoulders sagged, the weight of the sentence visibly crashing down on him. Bailiff, Adrian added, escort Mr. Callahan to holding. As the guard stepped forward, Callahan glanced back one final time. He looked at me, his lips parting as if to say something, but I met his stare with a cold, unwavering gaze. He said nothing. I watched as he was led away, the doors closing behind him with a satisfying thud. David leaned in slightly. That's it then. I nodded. That's it. But as I stood to leave, I knew the work wasn't entirely done. Later that evening, I found myself standing outside Grace Hill Community Church. The building loomed quietly under the soft glow of the streetlights. A handful of cars still dotted the parking lot, the remnants of the dwindling congregation trying to salvage what was left. I stepped inside, the empty sanctuary feeling colder than I remembered. Kelly had packed up most of her things after Callahan's arrest, but remnants of her remained. A jacket draped over a pew, a half-burned candle on the altar. I didn't come for her. I walked toward the pulpit, staring at the spot where Callahan once stood, preaching sermons he never believed in. Jonathan? I turned to see David standing at the entrance, hands in his coat pockets. Thought I'd find you here, he said, stepping inside. Just needed a minute, I replied. David walked up beside me, following my gaze toward the pulpit. They'll find a new pastor eventually, he said. Someone who can rebuild what Callahan destroyed. I'm not sure it can be rebuilt. David glanced at me. Maybe not right away, but it'll happen. I nodded but remained quiet. David rested a hand on my shoulder. You did what needed to be done. Callahan's gone. Kelly, she'll find her own way, one way or another. But you and the kids? You'll be all right. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of everything settle. For the first time in months, I believed him. I returned home that night to find Emily and Jack sitting in the living room, a movie playing softly in the background. Emily glanced up as I walked in, offering a small, hesitant smile. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, I replied, leaning against the doorway. It's over. Jack perked up. So Pastor Mark isn't coming back? No, Bud, I said with a slight grin. He's not coming back. Emily shifted slightly on the couch, her smile growing just a little. We weren't perfect, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. And that was enough.